Do these teams have a chance at winning some top prizes over the next couple of weeks in these playoff contests? We're going to go through some of our teams that have made it through to the next stage of Underdog tournaments. We're going to talk a little bit about FFPC tournaments. We're also going to preview ahead to the FFPC Playoff 2 contests, which are now live. You can get involved over there. So we're going to have a lot to discuss on today's show, Shawn. We did our recap show, which was obviously before Monday Night Football. We have Monday Night Football, where the Dallas Cowboys really and truly, easily dealt with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Buccaneers really, really struggling that one. Dak Prescott looking really good. Team looking good as a whole. So since we last talked, Shawn, what were your thoughts on Monday Night Football and how things played out there?
Well, it was an exciting game, even though it was an exciting game from a fantasy perspective. It was the end of the Tom Brady legend, that's for sure. He was awful throughout. Chris Godwin tried to carry him. Mike Evans tried to get some fantasy points at the end and failed to do so. But this was all about the Dallas Cowboys and Dak Prescott elevating multiple guys. You get the touchdown from Michael Gallup. That almost knocked you and me out of our Underdog Gauntlet tournament. You get the fourth down touchdown to CeeDee Lamb. Obviously, Dalton Schultz is the big winner of this game, scoring huge points. If you had him as a leverage play in FFPC, you're probably pretty happy right at this moment, because as they go in now to the 49ers, a terrible matchup for Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott. They're going to need to beat the 49ers through the air if they can. Prescott rallies back off of one of the worst performances of his career. He also rallies back off of that week 1 debacle. And so if you're, again, a Cowboys fan, you've got to be very excited about this setup. The defense also rising up after they allowed Sam Howell and the Commanders running game to tear them apart just 1 week ago. It does set us up for a lot of great narratives. I think this gives us the best playoff matchups that we could possibly have. The Giants right now look fantastic. The Jaguars are an up-and-coming team. The divisional round, could be the most fun weekend in all of football.
Yeah, and I know we were looking forward last week to the wild card weekend, but I did mention at that time, this is the weekend I think that I truly look forward to, when you kind of have the pure elite of the elite teams left. And I know some teams will be saying, well, maybe the New York Giants aren't that, maybe the Jacksonville Jaguars aren't that, but they did enough last week to fit into this final group of 8 teams. So we have the Bengals, the Bills, the Cowboys, the 49ers, with the Eagles in there, with the Kansas City Chiefs. So I think this is going to be absolutely awesome. 4 games, 2 Saturday, 2 Sunday, should be tremendous. And obviously those playoff contests and the teams we talk about today will be filtered through that. Shawn, just going back, you mentioned that we get a 4 passing touchdown day and a 1 rushing touchdown day for Dak Prescott in this one. Dalton Schultz is number 7 for 95 and 2 touchdowns. So massive day for him. And we did script through with that CeeDee Lamb touchdown that got us over the line. Some big 4th down plays here by the Cowboys, that Dak Prescott rushing touchdown and that CeeDee Lamb touchdown, both coming on 4th down. And you mentioned Tom Brady. I have to say that I was just baffled with his interception. I've talked about some red zone interceptions this year. That was not what we were expecting to see early in the game from Tom Brady. And I think that really set the outlook here. And Julio Jones gets in the end zone. It's always nice to see things like that happening, but obviously doesn't count for much in this one. So those games, Shawn, that I mentioned coming up this weekend, I think there's a lot to be excited about. Is there any particular one that you're most excited about, or are you just excited about them all? I know you're excited about the Chiefs because you want the Chiefs to win, but that Buffalo Cincy game should be something special here.
It should be. But as I've talked a little bit about on Stealing Bananas, I think the Jaguars are in with a chance. Now, you watched that first half last week, and you're thinking to yourself, any of those predictions about the Jaguars giving the Chiefs trouble look extremely silly, because not only are they not going to give the Chiefs trouble, but they're going to lose in a blowout fashion to the Chargers. That second half and the momentum they have off of it, the variety of weapons that they have, I think that game is going to be phenomenal. I think, too, if you played a Philadelphia upset team in the FFPC playoff contest, because one of the things, obviously, that you're looking to do there is to put together a lineup that would benefit in certain scenarios, one of which could be that the Giants advance and the Eagles lose. I think you have to be a lot more optimistic about that after this last week. I know I said some very flowery things about Daniel Jones on yesterday's show, but I truly believe that he is now emerging not just to a competent NFL starter, but a potentially elite starter. And we love Isaiah Hodgins. If you want a little bit more background to that, go in and check out the site. Blair Andrews, One Big Thing This Week, focuses on Hodgins and his journey and why we liked him as a prospect coming out of college in the first place. Especially if they get Saquon Barkley involved in the receiving game, then they now have the variety and the weapons to make this a compelling game with the Eagles. One of the things that you saw with all those Daniel Jones rushing attempts is that you are extending drives, you're keeping the ball out of the hands of Jalen Hurts and the Eagles playmakers. I mean, the Eagles are going to try and do the same thing on their side, but if the Giants can control the ball a little bit more than people expect, then the game will be close. And once the game is close, then anything could happen. We saw that with the Dolphins. We saw that with the Ravens. And we were almost out both of our AFC superpowers from the wild card weekend. I think we're going to have an upset this week. And what that upset is and how you play it is going to determine how well you do in the FFPC playoff 2. It's going to determine how you do in the second wave of gauntlet drafts. I just can't wait, Colm. It's been a lot of fun. And one of the reasons why it's been a lot of fun is that the approach that we took in the first wave went well. And you always feel more enthusiasm for the playoffs and for the fantasy contest when that does happen. You and I drafted 4 teams in the Underdog tournament, 2 gauntlet teams, one in Gauntlet 1, one in Gauntlet 2. We drafted a couple of mitten teams. We had our Gauntlet 1 team advance by 1 point with the CeeDee Lamb touchdown at the end. We had our mitten 1 team advance in a close matchup. We had our Gauntlet 2 team finish second, and the Gauntlet was one where the top 6 teams, only one of them advance. So you got to be the top guy. We finished second. That's unfortunate, but you like the fact that you got up in there. So 50% advance on that. The tactics that we discussed in our shows and on the website had a long series there. I feel good about them. I ended up doing 50 teams to make sure that the content matched with what's actually going on in these drafts, and then I could explain why and how we were taking this particular approach. 23 of the 50 teams ended up advancing. 6 additional teams finished second and were in the version of the contest where only 1 team advanced. So 29 of the 50 teams finished in the top 2. And while first round advance was a big part of what we were trying to accomplish, they are set up to where you have Super Bowl rosters and you can advance through multiple rounds in addition. Now, there are definitely some teams where if the Chargers had won, that would have helped, but especially kind of looking back and having T. Higgins as the highest rostered player and 0% of Gabe Davis to have the 23 out of 50 advance with 29 out of 50 in the top 2. I like the way that it worked. Now, could the playoffs have gone differently in the first weekend had it not happened that way? Obviously it could. So you don't want to sit there and say, oh, we knew exactly how it was going to work and it worked and do it exactly like that. But that gave me a good feeling about it. It was exciting. We got a lot to look forward to now as we go through the next several weeks. Colm, our Gauntlet 1 team, it was one of the earliest teams drafted. And so you're going to get ADPs that are very different than several weeks later. Very, very different. How does that team look?
Yeah, even I got Shawn to share the screenshots with me before we kicked this off, and the ADP is actually surprising in a number of these teams, and I'm looking forward to going through it. But I really like how this team in particular is stacking up. It's a Christian McCaffrey team, which for people who listened in to these shows when we drafted these teams, they're heavily influenced by Christian McCaffrey. We drafted from the 6th slot. We had Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Joe Mixon, Brandon Ayuk. Of course, Shawn, we get the now legendary quarterback who is Brock Purdy. We got him, Shawn, at that point at the 31st pick overall. It was the first pick of the 6th round. Last week, it started to get pretty comical. I was seeing, 1st, 2nd, 3rd overall picks for Purdy. I think Peter Overzet may have something to do with some of those selections being pushed up as high as they have been. But we got him there. Obviously, had a nice first game off the playoffs here. We did have Lamar Jackson then as our second quarterback. Obviously, that didn't play out because he didn't play, obviously. And now the Baltimore Ravens are out. We get DK Metcalf, who had the huge game this past week, Tyler Boyd, and then Tyler Lockett as well. When I looked through this team, Shawn, before we started recording, there's some interesting ADP, and one of those points is Saquon Barkley, who was the 49th pick in this draft. It was the first pick off the 9th round, and Obviously, he moved up a little bit as it went along, but he was somebody who at that time the Giants weren't as clear to make it in, and some of these back end of the draft picks were potential wildcard weekend plays. So Saquon Barkley at 49. If we could go back in time and make the perfect pick, I think it would be a case of skipping on Lamar Jackson and going DK Metcalf, Saquon Barkley back to back at that point. But overall, this is a roster that heading into this current week, we have Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Joe Mixon, Brandon Ayuk, Brock Purdy, and Tyler Boyd all available. Missing out, obviously, on Lamar Jackson, DK Metcalf, and Tyler Lockett. I'm pretty excited about this in the gauntlet. There's obviously going to be some challenges, but you mentioned as well, having a high percentage of T. Higgins and still making it through in some of these, and not having some of the heavy hitters maybe from last week, but still advancing. It is a situation where the way the combination of the players work out makes all these teams unique. Same in the FFPC playoff contest, and I think that makes it very interesting. Where you're kind of just hoping that those guys that aren't on a team where it's really stacked up that puts you in a hole to try and catch up. But how are you feeling about this particular lineup?
Really good. You mentioned it would have been great to have Barkley. This team drafted back when, we thought obviously Lamar Jackson was going to be able to play by playoff time, and the uncertainty around Brock Purdy was still very, very real. And at this point, if you're drafting a Purdy team, if you drafted a Purdy team in the last week and a half going into wildcard weekend, you'd have drafted him solo and been very happy to have done that. The other element here was that at this point in time, it did look like the Vikings were going to get the 2 seed. And so you're hoping to play those Seahawks against the Vikings, have a little bit better upset chance. But the Seahawks players do still come through, with Metcalf being the catalyst to push us across and get T. Higgins into another round where he potentially could do what he didn't do in wildcard weekend. Our approach, especially in the first half of the contest, when the prices were very palatable on 49ers and Bengals, was to play that as our Super Bowl. This is one of those teams to get it through here, especially in the Gauntlet 1. Very exciting and a live team. One of the reasons why so many of the teams made it, we did have, as you mentioned, a lot of Christian McCaffrey, did have a lot of Saquon Barkley. And so having the Giants upset last week helps those teams as we look to second round advance, because now Saquon Barkley will be a big weapon this weekend. That part of it doesn't obviously help this team, but big picture, that's one of the reasons why we're there with these teams. Colm, I can't wait. The other element of it here is that we did quite a bit of content on the FFPC playoff contest. And Colm, you and I have a couple teams in each of the contests at the $200 level and the $35 level that are looking good. Also had the good fortune to put together teams with Connor, Ben, and Bjorn Yang Burnett, who does our great waiver wire articles. Bjorn, a fantastic up-and-coming writer. Everybody should check him out. The team that he put together for me is currently 299th out of 16,000 in the FPC contest column. The team that you put together for us in that tournament is just a few spots behind, I think at 357. How are we looking for our FFPC playoff teams as we head into the divisional round?
Yeah, I think we're looking to be, again, in a pretty good spot. We did 3 teams together, which one of those teams is really in the mid-range, 151 points after this current week, but there is a long way to go. The other teams are 187 points, but our highest scoring team is in the FBG tournament, and that is at 192.2. My one regret, Shawn, from this weekend is that we talked about this on the recap show. We had some opportunities to maybe go with DK Metcalf, which I lent us to avoid. I think that 192 team could be right there in the mix at the top end if we had a DK Metcalf slotted in there. I don't know which one you're most excited about. They're all based in rosters that have CMC, Keenan Allen, and Travis Kelce. The 2 teams that have head off for us, one in each of the tournaments, also have TJ Hockenson, Saquon Barkley. We talked a little bit on the recap show about avoiding Justin Jefferson on 2 of the teams where we did go Hockenson, and I think that their pivot has worked out quite well for us. We did score relatively low, Shawn, in both of them with the defense. We have the Dallas defense in one that was 4 points. They have progressed through. We have the Jacksonville defense in the other that was 3 points. They have progressed through. So soft fading those defenses could still work out in the following round, but kickers and defenses was an area where we didn't hit, but we did hit on pretty much all the other players that are added in there. And those teams also are Travis Kelce teams, like I mentioned, but one has Devontae Smith, the other has AJ Brown. So it's going to be interesting, I think, how those wide receivers do this week could really make us pivot as to which way we're looking moving forward. But when we look at some of the rostership, Shawn, we mentioned some of these on the recap show, but DK Metcalf, this is a question I kind of had that I wanted to put to you. DK Metcalf is 3 to 4% owned across those tournaments, and the Dolphins DST was 2% owned. And obviously, the Dolphins put up 21 points, which is going to give them a big edge. DK Metcalf is a massive day, going to give them a big edge. When a player is 3 to 4 or 2% rostered, do you think that is a player who can make a difference, or is it unlikely based on how few teams they're actually rostered on?
Yeah, so you desperately want to hit on those guys who were not played. And that part of it was exciting because the teams I have with Ben, the team I have with Connor, those are Metcalf teams. And just that piece now positions us to finish high up in the tournament when everything else is more or less even. And so the tricky part here was trying to figure out how to get Metcalf and a Jaguar in. That's something that Connor and I talked about. It becomes difficult because then you start to fade some really high-end players that not only have extremely high projections, but you also expect them to advance through. In the end, obviously, that would have been the play. The move that we made on our teams and I made on other teams this last weekend that has been magnificent is to go with Hockenson with Barkley. So you're betting on the Vikings to lose. You're betting on Hockenson in this tight end premium format where he has been so brilliant with the Vikings to outscore Jefferson and perhaps outscore Jefferson in a big way, which is what happened. And then you have Barkley, the real stud, move along. The issue here is, you'd love to have Barkley be a little bit lower rostered himself. But those two pieces together, I think, have been the key to the contest along with that Metcalf piece. So that part of it, absolutely fantastic. The one regret that I have is that we had talked a lot about how Keenan Allen would potentially outscore Austin Eckler, especially in a loss, but that their projections and how white hot Allen had been. That part of that, and that's the kind of thing from a rally perspective too. But the issue here is that if they actually execute, and we mentioned it on the recap show, that Justin Herbert had Allen open in the end zone on 2 separate possessions. So it's not just like, he had a chance at 1 touchdown. This could have been a multi-touchdown game for Allen. The thesis, I think, was strong. It didn't play out that way. I do have some teams that are, I wouldn't say perfect, but they are very, very good. They project very, very well, but they have lost the points from Eckler's score down to Allen's score. The other thing there is that Eckler was underutilized in this game, and it really came down to those 2 touchdowns. Now, if you're betting against Eckler scoring, that's always a tough bet. He scores twice. So that part of it doesn't work. But those elements there with Hockenson also being somebody who's just not going to show up very often. Love that. And then Colm, across the different teams, I was spread through some Zay Jones, some Christian Kirk, some Evan Ingram. All 3 of those guys have hit. All 3 of those guys are moving forward. What are we looking at in terms of the roster percentages for Hockenson and for these Jaguars?
Yeah, so Hockenson, the other part just to mention with Hockenson, Shawn, something we did was to go with 2 tight ends in the tight end premium format. Now, Travis Kelce is somebody who's on pretty much 3/4 of the teams in this format, 72, almost 73% in the $35 and then 74% in the $200 contest. So having him is obviously going to be most teams across the board, but I think somewhere where we might be able to be different is to have him paired with Travis Kelce because he's only in 12 to 13% of contests across both formats. So having the double of those 2, I think, could be a little bit where we might have a slight edge. You mentioned also Christian Kirk, Zay Jones. Zay Jones 2% owned, Christian Kirk 12 to 14% owned across the tournaments. And I think we've seen this in DFS, and I've seen the discourse on Twitter over the last couple of weeks. I don't really think there's a reason for Zay Jones to be as under drafted or as underpriced across the DFS sites as well as Christian Kirk. You talked about Christian Kirk and how he's been kind of underrated at all stages of his career so far based on what he's been able to do. But I think what Zay Jones has done this season, 2% or rostership on Zay Jones is another tremendous edge that people are going to have. The other one I mentioned on the recap show that I think is huge is, and we have gone with Christian McCaffrey, but the way that some teams may get a substantial edge is that Christian McCaffrey is pretty much 3/4 owned across all formats, and Deebo Samuel is 2 to 3% owned, which I think is, just an astronomical edge if you have Deebo Samuel teams heading into these next couple of weeks.
I agree. I do think that McCaffrey is still going to be the play, but we've watched Elijah Mitchell be very involved in the last couple of games as well. We know that they plan to utilize this running game so heavily that they don't want to overextend McCaffrey. Obviously, I articulated my frustration or just disappointment, really, because I was rooting more or less against the Ravens, but they underutilized J.K. Dobbins. We know that the 49ers want McCaffrey ready to go in the AFC Championship game against the Eagles. We know that they want him ready for the Super Bowl against the Chiefs, the Bills, the Bengals. Mitchell is a guy who is interesting in the underdog format. As you put together the back half of your lineup there, Debo has that chance. And one of the things that we watched at the end of last season and then wasn't as much in evidence to start this year are all these game-breaking plays from Samuel. And the people who talk about, okay, well, you just can't do those all the time. You're going to have regression. You can't manage that type of efficiency all the time. They're both right and wrong in that for a full season, you're not going to be able to create those plays in every game. But the talent that is there, you have to take note of. In any individual game, he can obviously be a world breaker and a contest breaker in terms of what he does to both the McCaffrey scoring, the McCaffrey shares, what that does for you as a path through. When you're thinking about FFPC Playoff 2, if you like the Cowboys as an upset team here with how well Prescott played last night, with how well the defense played, then Debo becomes very interesting because one of the things that you're probably going to see, and one of the reasons why McCaffrey is someone that's so difficult to get away from, is that any multi-game stretch, his receiving ability and his touchdown scoring ability separates him by such a large margin. But any individual game stretch, you have a chance for Debo to be the guy and to be the guy by, a significant score. And so any type of upset now, as maybe McCaffrey is underused in a particular game, gives you a shot. The fact that Debo is right there with McCaffrey and scoring here means that a big game from Debo in a 49ers loss will suddenly mean that in the playoff 1 contest, he was the guy that you wanted, but then obviously he would be the guy in playoff 2 as well.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk about playoff 2 in a second, but the stuff we are talking through here and how these players were kind of thought of heading into last weekend, and obviously some of them having big games is going to put more people on them. But when we look at how teams were completely faded in this contest, it isn't really a surprise that Miami and Seattle led the way, 73.6% for Miami, 65.4% for Seattle. But when we look then, Baltimore were next up, which isn't really a surprise either, 26.2%. Justin Tucker, though, was the most rostered kicker in this format in the kind of 42 to 44% range. But Shawn, some of the teams that have advanced, we had Jacksonville at 10% faded, then we have Tampa Bay who haven't advanced, but we have New York Giants then at 8.7%. And we mentioned some of those teams that are Saquon Barkley teams. Immediately, that is going to give you a little bit of an advantage moving forward. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out because one of our teams is a Riley Patterson team, for example. Not very exciting. He is 8 to 9%. So maybe he does something that gives us a bit of an edge this week over those Tucker teams. We'll see how that plays out. I would rather have some, I guess, skill player positions available. But I just thought that Jacksonville being faded in 1 out of every 10 teams. And then you mentioned some of the players that you've added in. One of those teams we were talking about a moment ago is the Zay Jones team. I think that's an interesting edge. The big difference, Shawn, as we move into the playoff 2 contest is there is no fade this week. It is pretty much similar rules, but there's no kicker, no defense. You have 8 teams obviously remaining in the playoffs. It is 8 players that you have to slot into that lineup, and it's going to be similar. There's a $35 contest, there's a $200 contest, so both options available to play in. The roster requirements for this one is going to be those 8 players that I mentioned: 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 2 flexes. The flexes can obviously be running back, wide receiver, or tight end. How, Shawn, do you think some of the strategy changes in this based on, obviously you don't have to worry about the kicker or defense, and you also don't have to worry about which team to fade. So it's a case of picking players across all lineups. But I think that may lead to a situation where there's even more kind of duplicated lineups with players who are, very, very popular. For example, when you're not having to dip down into the kicker defense pool or fade 2 teams like we had to last weekend.
The first little difference here is that because all of these teams are going to play the same number of games, Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes become a little bit more interesting. And so when you're looking at the roster percentages for the first week, you want to make sure that you're adjusting mentally for some of the tweaks here. And so Josh Allen, unlikely to have such a heavy advantage in the second week. One of the things about Josh Allen, and part of this advantage still continues on, but he's a quarterback who, because of his profile and because of some of the specific profiles of other players, Josh Allen in an AFC championship game loss could still be the quarterback that you want. And we went through this in the original articles last week, but Travis Kelce, with his extremely high scoring levels, could be the highest scoring player in the Super Bowl. You have the chance that the Eagles, if they make it, would not be the highest scoring team. Obviously, if you have Christian McCaffrey in the Super Bowl, he could be the highest scoring player there. Now, with how dynamic Brock Purdy has been, it becomes more difficult to fade him as the catalyst, as the engine for this team. As he throws these touchdown passes, you're going to see him scoring at a higher level than I think people even a week ago would have been willing to countenance. So you do have a shifting dynamic there. What we're looking to do is to play teams and to play combinations that make sense together and that are going to be a little bit less played than what the field is doing. The problem that we had with the Underdog tournament and the real kind of fly in the ointment as that developed was that, especially early on when we're drafting through the Bengals, it looks like the Ravens will be the 5 seed. And so you're not going to hit this elite defense in the first round. The Bengals really the disappointing offensive team, so you don't get points from Joe Mixon. Joe Burrow, even though his score is fine, ends up coming in toward the bottom at the quarterback position. You don't get anything from T. Higgins. You don't have one of these big scores from the peripheral players like we saw Michael Gallup getting into the end zone. You have Gabriel Davis, who is very much a peripheral player for the Buffalo Bills at this point, having a huge game. You didn't get that from them. I think that's going to knock down their usage in a variety of contests and make them interesting in a game with the Bills that projects to be very different, right? If you had Bengals against the Chargers or the Dolphins, because again, the Dolphins crater from a pretty decent playoff seed all the way out, then that game for the Bengals looks a lot better in the first round. Now we come into a contest where Bengals against Bills and then Bengals against Chiefs and then Bengals against, especially Eagles, you're looking at them potentially putting up massive point totals, getting a lot of guys involved, having Burrow being an interesting play, even without elite rushing ability. And one of the things that Burrow has done is actually added some sleeper value with the legs a lot through touchdowns. We wouldn't necessarily expect that to continue, a little bit fluky there. But when you have Chase and Higgins and Boyd and Hurst and some of these other pieces, he's somebody who I don't think he's the best play by any stretch. And yet the gap between how good of a play he is and how many people play it may still be something that you at least want to consider. So you think through that part of it. I also think this game with the Chiefs and the Jaguars is interesting because one of the things that we're probably looking at here as we think about playoff 2, as we think about Underdog, is that you want to have your team play through a power team on one side and then potentially a mild upset and a big upset on the other side. Again, with the FFPC, one of the things that we're doing is we can only play one player from each team. But even as you do that, the number 2 player that you play, as opposed to playing the pure chalk lineup. Because one of the things we need to do, obviously we have to score as many points as possible, and we have to put out a lineup that isn't duplicated by everyone. Colm, you were kind of mentioning to me that one of the lineups was duplicated how many times?
I think it was 206.
So if you have to split the pot 206 ways, then that part isn't good for you. And just not necessarily going to hit even the very chalky lineup. So we're looking for pivots, but pivots that make sense and pivots that tell a story. Colm, do you have a game here as we go into the divisional round that you think is either ripe for an upset or ripe for a fantasy scoring environment that maybe people are underplaying?
I think that I think all the games are really prime for high scoring matchups. I do think the Giants Eagles game could flatter to deceive. I don't think maybe it will be as high scoring as maybe we're hoping for. I think it could be the lower scoring game of the weekend. Now, that could be famous last words, and it could become a monster shootout, but it's the one that I'm probably looking to fade out of the most. And for us, Shawn will probably do that through Devontae Smith, for example. Rather, in those games where I think that it mightn't be a massive hit, I would be trying to take the lower end off those players. Obviously, Saquon Barkley is going to be massively rostered in that. So is AJ Brown. So is potentially Jalen Hurts. I think there's a very even spread this week, and I think that's what makes this week's contest that much more interesting. When we look through last week to try and get an idea of how this week might play out, Josh Allen obviously had the extra game versus Patrick Mahomes or versus Jalen Hurts. He was 44 to 49% across both tournaments, whereas Mahomes, Hurts, Burrow, they were all in the kind of 14 to 16% range. Obviously, that's going to come much more in line this week, which for people who maybe faded Josh Allen in the last contest, maybe it makes him more appealing at a lower rostership. But players then like Brock Purdy was, in the 1 to 2% range. We have guys then like, Trevor Lawrence, Daniel Jones, who are less than 1% across both contests. Dak Prescott, less than 1% across both contests. I think it tightens up a lot this week, and I think we see a lot more players closer in percentages. And that's going to be the same for guys like Christian McCaffrey as well, guys like Saquon Barkley, who I mentioned. But I think at the running back position, we might see that escalate a little bit more, and we might see a very heavy concentration there. Last week's most drafted player was Justin Jefferson, who is no longer obviously available in the contest. So I think that's going to make that a little bit more appealing to the wide receivers. But I'm just very excited across all games. But I do feel that the hype around the Eagles and the Giants may lead to a little bit of disappointment for people. Do you feel that way, or do you think I'm wrong there?
Well, anytime that you have multiple rushing quarterbacks, you're looking at the potential for a low total play volume game. And I think that's the threat if you're hoping for a lot of volume for Saquon Barkley. You look at the rushing numbers for him versus Daniel Jones. Obviously, Barkley's so dynamic. He breaks the long touchdown run in the last game. He takes one of his receptions and generates some big yardage with that. But one of the issues that Barkley has had in this offense is that he needs to break those plays in order to put up big fantasy totals. He went through a very down stretch during the season where he wasn't breaking those plays and they weren't getting him the ball through the air. And he became even, borderline unstartable in just regular fantasy leagues, which you would never think would possibly be the case for a Saquon Barkley. We've come back out of that. I like the dynamism. I like what Brian Daboll is doing. I think that you have to look very closely at any play that he's not included, but especially if you think that the Giants are going to get behind. I don't think that Isaiah Hodgins is in a fluke in any way, shape, or form. But the other thing you can do is you can pivot off of that after the big game and go back to Richie James, who's also been very hot, but was the number 3 receiver in this previous game. You would expect that to push his roster percentage down very, very low in this upcoming game. One of the other interesting constructions that you can try, and I do think it will be trendier this week than it might have been, because what happened in the past week sticks in your head and you feel like, okay, well, this is the path that we want to take. But you saw the big game from Dalton Schultz. We had a game from Dawson Knox where if his second touchdown isn't overturned, then he has the quality game. I think that you can have Goddard and Kelsey and Ingram and Schultz, and you can put together this tight end roster that's very fun. Now, I mentioned the 4 tight ends. Obviously, you can't do that in this particular format. It just has the 2 flex spots, but you can get up to 3 there. Tight ends, I do think will be trendy, both because of their touchdown scoring potential in a loss. So if you like a particular team to lose, that tight end becomes really interesting, just like TJ Hockenson was last week, even though he didn't score, but just the raw numbers there. But then also with the tight end premium, what they have to do to create a game where they gap the other players, that part stands out to me. The other element here is that one of the reasons why we played Zay Jones and Christian Kirk in a variety of lineups is that game with the Chargers was a toss-up, and the Jaguars players just should have been more expensive across the board to start with. The problem is that Travis Etienne in a 1-game or a 2-game situation, I didn't feel like that was, well, when I say feel like, the matchups really didn't project to be as good for him as you would really want, the receivers, where the dynamism comes from when you look to week 2 with the Chiefs, where if the Jags win, then it's because Zay Jones and Christian Kirk lit them up. Now, I mean, are there some extreme dark horse scenarios where they win in a different way, obviously, but that's how that game projects to play, with Trevor Lawrence being unstoppable in the second half there. So you like that in a 2-game stretch with the Jags. The problem is that the Jags in a win now, and you go back to maybe that's not what you want in the Bills, Bengals, but especially with the Bills, again, you're going to be able to go through those receivers would be the way to play it. I think Jacksonville, a team to put quite a bit of time into thinking what your scenario is. Colm, it's going to be.
I think Shawn. I think Shawn's just putting he just wants to tell everyone that Jacksonville are going to upset the Chiefs, so the Chiefs are going to go out and crush the Jaguars, and Shawn will be happy come next week. I think that you're putting all that juju out there, Shawn, but it's going to be Juju Smith-Schuster and the Chiefs that are happy at the end of it all.
Well, Jacksonville put up 40 on the Cowboys. They come from 27 down against the Chargers. We know they can do it. We also know Andy Reid will have had an extra week to prepare. We know that they're going to have a ton of specific plays in this game that are more or less unstoppable. If Sky Moore is able to go out and do just a couple of plays successfully, I mean, my main thing is that as long as they don't have Sky Moore returning punts, they're probably in decent shape in this game. But you're going to see, you're going to see 2 Kadarius Toney touchdowns in this, right? I mean, you can't actually play wide receiver, but Andy Reid is the gadget play guru extraordinaire. I mean, no one runs gadget plays like Andy Reid, and there's no player in the NFL where that's what they were born to do, like Kadarius Toney. Kadarius Toney in a Chiefs loss, right? That's your play there. I don't think that we're going to have too much roster exposure to Toney. I mean, it's probably 50-50 whether he pulls both hamstrings in practice this week. But again,
I like the way you put in the disclaimer, Shawn, there. You said he was going to have 2 touchdowns, and then you said we're probably not going to have him on any roster. So that was a good disclaimer to add in.
Yeah. Colm, take us out with your divisional round game picks.
Just winners?
Winners.
I'm going to be very, very low-key here, Shawn. I'm going to go pretty much. I think the only game for me that there's 2 games that are legit question marks overall, and that is Cincy, Buffalo, and Dallas, San Francisco. I think we see the 2 number 1 seeds win, both KC and Philadelphia. I think they'll win pretty comfortably in the end. It might be a little bit closer in the first half, but they get the job done. I think Cincy, Buffalo is very, very interesting, and I'm finding it very hard to call a winner at the moment in that one. I just have a feeling Cincinnati are going to take it. And then with the other one, I think the 49ers are the better overall team. We've talked about that in a number of podcasts. Are we fully convinced that Brock Purdy's going to continue to do that? I think the Dallas defense is a really legitimate test here for him. But I'm still going to say that the 49ers have enough to get it done. I think that game is going to be very interesting. Where are you disagreeing? Tell me where the disagreements are. I know you're picking the Jaguars, but who else are you picking?
Well, the 2 teams I would love to see in the NFC Championship game are the Eagles and the Giants. Obviously, we can't get that. They play each other.
Lucky
I'm going to go ahead and pick the Giants. Giants upset. Right? We got to get an upset in there.
Daniel Jones, Super Bowl MVP. That's where Shawn is going with this train.
Yeah, we'll have to check in with Ben and Ceiling Lines and see what our props are for that, how much we have to pay to get Daniel Jones as the MVP. Go 49ers. We're going to go Chiefs. This Bills-Bengals game I have a lot of trouble with because, the Bengals should be playing at home. They also, unfortunately, will be playing without their offensive line. That makes it a lot more difficult. But Bengals, I'm going to go Giants, 49ers, Chiefs, Bengals. I'm happy with any of the teams getting through this week. Every team presents a great storyline for the 2 respective championship games. It's going to be an awesome week of football.
Yeah, all the storylines coming out of this week and entering next weekend are, they're all mouthwatering no matter what way it plays out. So excited for that. We will be back, Shawn, with another show later this week. We're going to do another Underdog draft, talk some strategy through that. But if you're playing over at the FFPC, as I mentioned, both options available, similar to last weekend, $200 entry or $35 entry. And it's basically pick one player from all 8 teams and see how it plays out through the Super Bowl, accumulating those points. I think that is a super fun format to head on over and check out over at myffpc.com. Shawn, I always ask people to subscribe to the podcast feed. I'm going to ask them if they're still listening to drop us a written and review. We do really appreciate that. We're hovering, getting closer to 200 reviews over there on Apple Podcasts, but do drop us a review. If you have left one in the past, head on over, add a comment to it, add something else to it. Say that Shawn loves the Jacksonville Jaguars to it, whatever you want to do, and that will really help us out a lot. But my name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarland. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Check out his work up on RotoViz.com, including the FFPC contest information that will be out as the week progresses here. We will be back on Thursday with another show for you, and until then, have a good one.
And Colm, one of the things that we're looking at that specifically will be dramatically different for playoff 2 and then trickles down to every part of the lineup construction is going to be the quarterback position. Playoff 1, we have Josh Allen overwhelmingly rostered, in part because with the extra week and with the dynamic players like Travis Kelce and Christian McCaffrey who could match up in the Super Bowl and score a ton of points, Josh Allen, a viable play on the optimal lineup, even in an AFC Championship game loss. Some of those dynamics shift a little bit now with all of the quarterbacks getting to play the same number of weeks. In a Philadelphia Eagles victory, obviously, Jalen Hurts becomes very, very appetizing there. Are there ways they can play out where his production is funneled so in such a concentrated way through an A.J. Brown or a Dallas Goedert that you get some other result? Yes, obviously, if you win, but you win in a shootout where Patrick Mahomes is trying to bring the Chiefs back. Obviously, Chiefs win or loss in the Super Bowl. Mahomes very interesting, but obviously Travis Kelce then there as well for the potential massive score. We talked in the first article about how there was an entire month this season that Kelce outscored Mahomes, only outscored it 5 times for the season combined. So obviously, only outscored him 5 times on the season combined. We know that Mahomes has the edge there. We also know that Jerick McKinnon has outscored him for an extended stretch recently. McKinnon, a much more interesting play if you think the Jaguars are going to spring the upset this week, but a more balanced roster percentage across the quarterback position in playoff 2 opens up some more scenarios, creates some more variety, but also something that you want to consider and make sure you've mentally adjusted for as you project what you think the roster levels are going to be for your competition.